points tonight in my speech. First of all, I'm going to talk about how the Seanad isn't actually as important as it's painted to be, why getting rid of it isn't going to suddenly get rid of democracy, like that's a fallacy. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how reform won't happen because, you know, it hasn't happened in the last however many years that the Seanad has existed. And finally, just to make the case for Sean and Jim, I'm going to talk about again how the Seanad in itself is an irredeemable institution, how it's something that is actually harmful to democracy, something that has stymied Irish democracy for the number of years in which it has existed. But first, some extraneous rebuttal that doesn't quite fit into the rest of my speech. So Mike got up here and he told us that we shouldn't get rid of the Seanad because in 50 years it could be a problem. Most things could be a problem in 50 years. If we were to go with that attitude and that rhetoric, we would never change anything in that situation. I don't think that's an argument to make. We also got this idea from Mike that the rush legislation through Dáil is a bad thing and the Seanad prevents that from happening. But rush legislation always happens in the Dáil. Like the fact that the Dáil can actually pass it on to the Seanad and make them the scapegoats for the rush legislation means that the Seanad generally doesn't do anything. For example, when it came to the banking crisis, like where was the Seanad then? Where was the Seanad saying halt and stop this? No, they were there because, as I'll explain to you in my last point, like the whip system tacitly exists within the Seanad. To say that the whip system does not exist is wrong, and Jim gave you figures for that, because when he talked about the numbers of like Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil TDs in there, TDs, yeah, according to senators in there, like the whip system tacitly exists within the Seanad, and to say that it doesn't is false. So, why is the Seanad not as important as painted out to be? Like the Seanad, as an upper house, has no teeth. Like it can only delay legislation when it decides to do that, because the whip system does exist within it, and it can only at that point delay legislation for 6 months. They have no jurisdiction over certain areas, and you are told by proposition side that the Cabinet does not have to answer to the Seanad, which is something that's ridiculous. Like the Seanad does not have teeth, the Seanad is unable to actually have any proper, to bring in any kind of proper change, or to have, it's not the check and balance that's painted to be, it simply isn't. Like the Seanad can't even introduce legislation, and when legislation passes through the Seanad, they can only suggest amendments, and that's it. Like that, as a thing within itself, the Seanad is powerless, it has no teeth. And we don't think that this thing should exist just to sit there like doing nothing as it has done for the last number of years. Which brings me on to my second point, that reform won't happen because, duh, reform has never happened within the Seanad. So we get this idea again from Mike that the Seanad is just full of liberal people who will actually, who bring in much greater ideas. First point of rebuttal, Roland Mullen. Second point of rebuttal, like the whip system does exist. So when Jim was telling you that the fact that out of the number of TDs at the moment, my dad's calling me, the number of TDs at the moment, there are 19 Fine Gael TDs and there are 14 Fianna Fáil TDs. Like the two bipartisan parties within the state. Like it has always been like that. Like the Seanad has always been filled in with the whip system. Like just because they're not as enforced as within the Dáil doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It does exist there. So the idea, like the Seanad, essentially we're paying to have this institution which can do less than an opposition party in the Dáil can do. Like an opposition party isn't even in government, and they still have more teeth than the Seanad does. Like this, it doesn't make sense to hold on to it. We also get this idea that like reform is a way to fix the Seanad. Okay, like the Seanad, the last time, like an important point, and I think it is an important point, is the fact that only graduates of NUI and Trinity actually have a vote in the Seanad. Sorry, like no offense, but have you met Galway graduates? Yeah, like the fact that our degrees, our education here in the University of Limerick, like an institution which is just as valid as any of the NUI institutions, the fact that we don't have a vote when we become postgraduates means that reform has never happened. The last time that was actually questioned was in 1979. That was the last time it was questioned whether UL graduates should have a vote within the Dáil or within the Seanad. Like I think that's ridiculous, and also proof that reform does not happen. Like to say that we'll have a reformed Seanad after this is a lie, because it's never happened, and I don't think it ever will. Like the Seanad also is an elitist institution. Like the fact that graduates of this certain class of people are actually allowed to have any voice at all in it, means that it is an elitist institution, which as Sean told you, is something that ideologically does not fit in with our democracy. The idea that there is a class of people who have this say over an institution for themselves alone is something that's completely at odds with the idea that every person has a vote within our state, the idea that we live within a democracy that is truly egalitarian, and that's not going to change. And I think the Seanad, after the Seanad has been abolished, Fine Gael will have to reform the Dáil. They don't have that scapegoat anymore. They don't have that straw man. Fine Gael will have to will have to reform the Dáil in that situation. Which brings me on to my last point of summation, which is the arguments that Sean and Jim brought you. So yes, we believe that going back to the point on elitism, if we were to reform the Seanad, if we were to actually include every person who's entitled to have a vote in the state in voting for the Seanad as well, you're creating conflict between the two houses. Again, as Jim told you, why do you want to elect two Dáils? That makes no sense. So something that's implicit within the Seanad is an elitism, is an exclusivity, is something that's not allowed, that we don't think should be a part of our democracy. Again, we say that's a failed product of a failed decade. We also say that the whip system still tacitly exists, and the fact that the Seanad will be gone means that Fine Gael are really going to have to look hard at the whip system as it exists within the Dáil. They no longer have this extra house to pass all their rush legislation onto for them just to tick the boxes and make a few small changes to it which don't mean anything. We think that that's something that we think it's time that we actually had a look at what the Dáil itself does, and if we actually got rid of this scapegoat, and if we got rid of this distraction, which is what it is. So yes, to finish my speech, Mr. Donnelly finished his speech by telling us that it's good to dream. I say it's time we woke up.